The historic Bytown Museum stands as a monument to the workers who constructed the Rideau Canal. Workers were pushed to work extremely hard, long hours, and their health was not necessarily important to the supervisors of the canal. They had a timeline, and that's what they followed. Death did not stop the construction of the Rideau Canal. The exhibits displaying the harsh conditions the workers experienced while building the canal may be one reason that attracts the spirits to the building. Today, stories are told of an array of paranormal activity happening in the building. For example, lights turn off and on, objects are moved, and people report seeing or feeling a presence in the building.
I've been working as the museum director for four years. You cannot work in this building without having some paranormal experiences. One of the strangest events, because when I first started working here, I was a bit of a skeptic. And Hélène, who works here, said that the playing cards in one of our displays, the parlor display in the By parlor, she said they would move. And I said, yes, 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 I'm sure it's the visitors. So finally, this went on for a while, and she said, all right, when we leave, before we leave tonight, you place the cards in any way that you want. And since the two of us drove to work together, we knew that nobody else would be in the building. And there are no breezes that can move cards. The building is sealed because we are a museum. So the very next morning, I came upstairs first, and the playing cards were on the floor. They weren't only rearranged on the table, they were on the floor to sort of make a point. And that's sort of when I started to think, okay, there's something to the spirit thing.
Duncan McNabb is believed to be one of the spirits inhabiting the museum. McNabb was a supervisor of the Rideau Canal and worked out of this building. Current employees of the museum admit that if Duncan's name is mentioned, the lights may flicker or the computers in the building go amok.
On one of the main computers in the gift shop, occasionally when the name Duncan McNabb is mentioned, it has been known that this computer would turn off and then reboot itself and turn back on. Last summer when I was here in the gift shop, I was speaking to one of the staff here at the museum. When I mentioned the name Duncan McNabb, the computer did shut down and rebooted, but this time, instead of just restarting itself, it started to print out text on the screen. Again and again, it printed the words, Lieutenant Colonel John By, Lieutenant Colonel John By. Some of the staff here have guessed that the reason the computer printed those words is that it was a message from the spirit trying to tell us, perhaps, that we had the person wrong, perhaps that it wasn't Duncan McNabb, but that it was Colonel By, or that perhaps there's more than one ghost here at the museum.
One of the major areas of activity in the building is the gift shop. People report objects being moved on their own, doors refuse to be open, and lights often flicker on their own.
My name is Alan. I've worked here at the Bytown Museum for about 3 years, and in that time I've seen and I've heard some strange things. I work in the gift shop, and one of the responsibilities is to arrange the display cases, and I'd arranged some ceramic bears just prior to me leaving that evening. When I came in and opened up the shop at 7 o'clock the following morning, I noticed that 2 of the bears from the display case were on the floor. I picked them up and went back to the display case, then noticing that the other bears in the case had been turned upside down, but the case was locked. There was no way that that could have happened. I then realized that I had to turn the alarm off. So I rushed over to the control panel, but when I reached to turn off the alarm, something shoved me hard against the wall. I reached around, I ran over and turned on the lights, but there was nothing there. I can't explain it. I don't know what happened, but it scared me pretty fierce.
Perhaps the most convincing encounter to happen here at the museum happened a couple of falls ago to myself and some of my staff. We were having a staff party here at the museum where we decided to watch some movies and spend the night, I guess, telling some tales and spooking each other out. And afterwards we decided to go downstairs to close up. We went down to the first floor to the gift shop, and before we left I had to set the alarms and the motion detectors. when all of a sudden the door started to vibrate, a little at first, and then it shook violently and very heavily, as though somebody on the other side were pushing the door and banging on it, trying to get out. I was absolutely terrified. I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. When we later got outside, I asked them what they'd seen, and in fact, they had not seen the door shaking at all. They had heard were a set of heavy footsteps crossing the floor above them, walking along right towards the spot where they were standing. All of us were quite convinced by this experience, and ever since then we felt that it's one of the more haunted buildings here in Ottawa.
One unusual exhibit that draws a lot of attention, not only from employees but also visitors to the museum, is the cast hand of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, one of the Fathers of Confederation. D'Arcy McGee was shot down in cold blood by Patrick Wayland one evening in Ottawa. Since McGee was shot in the face, instead of making a cast of his facial features, the officials decided to make a cast of his hand. One time, a staff employee found that the case had been removed covering the cast hand. It was seated beside the stand. The employee went to handle the cast hand of D'Arcy McGee and couldn't believe how ice cold it felt. She was shocked. The Bytown Museum is a good example of spirit imprinting, and that is the energy that is surrounded by the objects. When an object or a possession of a person is placed on exhibit after they die, there's a good possibility that they may be connected to that object. So Bytown Museum, like many other museums throughout the country, all experience a similar activity around artifacts.
So when we see old objects or artifacts or in old buildings, we tend to be filled with some sense of awe. Wouldn't attract any attention at all in Europe, where it would be almost like yesterday to say something was built 300 years ago. We feel this awe, and we have two directions in which we can go. We can use that awe as a springboard to explore the history of the objects or the building, to find out what they really represent, what the true story is behind them, and learn a great deal about the culture that produced them. Or we can simply focus in on something that is sort of like mental candy, mental popcorn, the ghost stories, the hauntings, the sensational aspect of it that in all likelihood isn't true to begin with. And even if it were true, it's so minor and so inconsequential that for it to divert us from a study of the larger history of these objects, that's kind of sad. There's no evidence that there are ghosts. There's no evidence that objects are associated to disembodied spirits. But there's lots of evidence, we take this as a given, that objects, carvings, and so forth were made by real people sometime in the past, and they can guide us to not only understanding those people at that time, but also help inform us about people in general, and perhaps we'll learn something about ourselves.
People say, "Are you afraid working in this building?" And I recall something my father told me when I was very, very young, that we had no reason to fear the dead, that they would never hurt you, that it was the living that would get you every time. And working in this building, those words have often come back to me.